We're good to go? Great. Good morning. I would like to welcome you to the second day of the Vienna Migration Conference. I am Sedef Steering. I'm heading the regional office for the Secrets region in ICMPD. I'm also the head of the secretariat for the Budapest process and would like to welcome all of you. I see that the early birds are here today, and I'm sure the rest will join us in a short while or later. Yesterday, we already looked at Afghanistan and the unfolding situation there. But today, once again, we want to visit the region. We want to revisit Afghanistan and the Secrets region. And we would now like to focus more on the international and European responses and perspectives to the unfolding situation in Afghanistan. As said yesterday, we heard from the immediate neighborhood, Tajikistan and Iran. We're going to stay still a bit in the region with Turkey, but we want to move farther away to Europe and to international responses. So today I'm joined by four panelists. Mr. Khyber Farahi is the former senior advisor to former President Ghani on migration affairs. He and we worked together before, and he knows also, of course, our work, and he was involved in several stages of ICMPD's cooperation with the government, with the then government of Afghanistan. I'm also pleased to welcome Mr. Savaş Ünlü, Director General of the Directorate General of Migration Management of Turkey, Ministry of Interior. We also work together, of course, within the framework of the Budapest process. I do also have two more panelists, Mr. Joost Klarenbeek, Special Envoy for Migration from the Netherlands. Very pleased to have you. And Mr. Kevin Allen from UNHCR, the Principal Liaison Advisor for the Asia and Pacific region, coming from Geneva, so very pleased to have you as well.
Thank you.
As we already discussed yesterday, the rapid turn of events in Afghanistan had, of course, have shocked all of us, many in the region and also in Europe and beyond. But this also made all kind of previous scenario building, planning and risk forecasting very redundant almost all of a sudden. So the new situation prompts us to assess the situation once again in order to create a new and responsive response framework by the international community, by the countries in the region. We have all witnessed that during the NATO withdrawal, a large exodus of Afghanistan's brightest and most educated people took place. And the effects of that we will probably see in the years to come. And we will also probably witness, as discussed, as said yesterday, a socio-economic instability in addition to the geopolitical instability we're already seeing. What we're also expecting is a sharp increase in poverty, destitution, and it is already happening. The new regime on the ground has, of course, an immensely challenging time laying ahead of it. If it fails to ensure socio-economic stability, then the social fabric of the country will deteriorate further and until it may collapse, and leading to further waves of civilian displacement. I think this was said also very well, very openly by speakers yesterday. So there is really also a real fear that persecution of minority and ethnic and sectarian communities, as well as women and civil society, might take place. So there is a real concern for all of us, both in the region, Secrets region, in the immediate neighborhood, as well as beyond in Europe. There is concern for instability, of further mass displacement, and of course of protection. That's why we have now assembled four panelists, national representatives, development, humanitarian aid, and regional experts to discuss the issue surrounding the unfolding situation in Afghanistan and try to explore some workable solutions for the immediate future, as well as maybe looking into the longer term. I would like to start with the situation in Afghanistan with you, Khyber. So As mentioned, we've really worked on a lot of issues together, and there have been a lot of investments in Afghanistan by the international community. What is remaining, or what do you think could be remaining from those international investments in Afghanistan today, especially, of course, in terms of migration management, but also socioeconomic development? Maybe some of you may be aware in the audience, I suppose not, but there were a lot of programs at community level targeting migration, targeting development, and also targeting the integration of returnees. Is there anything maybe that's left behind that can be used from those 20 years of investment in Afghanistan right now?
Thank you very much, Sadaf, for the opportunity. It's great to be here again for the Vienna Migration Conference under completely different circumstances than I visited last time. We're dealing with a obviously different context. When I was here in 2018, we were working on a national response for the returnees coming into Afghanistan. And now, just to add to the context, Taliban's takeover, economic crisis, a drought that was declared even before Taliban's takeover, COVID-19 displacement has put Afghanistan at the verge of a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions have been displaced internally, and many, many millions will be forced to leave Afghanistan. And then there's, of course, the oppression of Taliban against, women's rights, girls' education, the rights of minorities, the threat from ISK. All of this, I think, there are obvious concerns that it's going to force millions to go out. I think Afghans are trapped right now, right? Borders are closed. Everyone is waiting for a way to go out. And as Dr. Abdullah was saying, you can't blame them because this is a different situation. This is not, we had our issues before, but, we had a government, so one could argue that they should be staying in Afghanistan. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is around the issue of what do you do about it. And so I think the primary goal obviously should be to reduce these pressures in the first place. For Afghans not to flee. And this requires, obviously, engagement with the Taliban. And engagement shouldn't mean recognition, but I know that there's a lot of discussion around how do you engage with Taliban. These are difficult actors. There's a lot that the international community don't know or is figuring out. So I'll briefly talk about some of the areas where they can start engaging and some of the areas where the international community should perhaps not engage, and then we can come back to a couple of points I have on where the situation with the host countries is. So I guess we can all agree that it's a political and ethical necessity to prevent this catastrophe and therefore prevent people from leaving. There are some gains that can be sustained. So in the immediate term, I think health services and community-based food and cash assistance is critical. This should be unconditional. But obviously, there has to be some basic principles to agree upon with the Taliban. And one of the things that, Sadaf, you were talking about, one of the ways in which I think the international community can prevent capture is to use, obviously go through the international agencies, the UN agencies, but work with the community development councils. These are the councils that were created through our flagship National Solidarity Program. It's a community development program back in 2003. They were created across the country in 35,000 villages out of 40,000. They spend $1.8 billion through these community development councils. They are obviously apolitical. They're locally elected councils. They have enjoyed a lot of recognition, credibility. They have worked before Taliban's takeover in areas controlled by the Taliban. It's massive investment that went into building these institutions over the past 20 years. And so I think there's obviously a real chance of sustaining those institutions, but for very important reasons. One is that with the new situation, women mobility is going to be a lot harder than it was before. That means any services, any assistance that comes to these villages can be captured or can go to, they won't have access to it. And so the mechanism that these institutions have created through their work in the last 20 years is really that kind of targeting in the community and working with all groups. There are some things that have to be agreed based on negotiated principles. So, for example, water and sanitation, it should be agreed with the Taliban. They won't be taxed. And that, again, as I mentioned, go through CDCs. Working in education, I think, should be conditional upon complete access to girls, and obviously working on the curriculum. There are some areas that the international community shouldn't engage because the intervention of the last 20 years haven't yielded any good results, and that's agriculture, it's energy and telecommunication, and of course the salaries of the civil servants. These are areas that I think that the international community shouldn't engage. As part of the general discussion with the Taliban, I think it's important that, using our regional countries' influence, is to reduce the fear and respect the rights. And I know that it's easily said than done, but unless people are given some assurances, because I'm sure you have heard growing incidents of oppression against Hazaras, the whole situation of women, protesters, and as I mentioned earlier, education. You can't expect the women who have had new hopes, new dreams in the last 20 years, their families, to just live in Afghanistan for nothing, for a future they won't have. And basically get invisible. The same with minors. So I think these are important. These are more political. I know political negotiations, and this is why I try to differentiate between what can and should be done now and what has to be done over time, because I know there are concerns about the legitimacy of Taliban and their recognition. I think I'll stop here, and then we can come back to.
Thank you, Khyber. Yes, I want to come back to some of the issues you've raised, but I want to move on to the next speaker. We'll come back to this development aspect, community structures that have been placed, and also women. Looking at Turkey now, Turkey is a destination country increasingly for Afghans. There are 300,000 Afghans, as far as I know, in Turkey, and of course it's also the primary transit and hub for migrants from the whole Cyprus region as well as Afghanistan. So we also heard yesterday Turkey is hosting about 4 million Syrian refugees and others. And indeed, hosting such a large population has, of course, had a big burden, has been a big burden for Turkey, on Turkey. Yes, yet Turkey has shown the ability to be hospitable and to welcome these refugees. However, the current scenario demands that multilateral efforts are made to address the unfolding situation in Afghanistan. In that regard, what is Turkey willing to commit to? If it is not hosting more refugees, and we heard that yesterday, can Turkey provide more relief aid to countries in the region, to Afghanistan, but also in the region, bilaterally or via multilateral aid assistance platforms?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me start with clarifying some statistics. Currently, Turkey is hosting 3.7 million, slightly above 3.7 million Syrians under temporary protection status, and more than 300,000 other nationals as the conditional refugee, under the conditional refugee status. So the overall number under various protection status is above 4 million. So these are the exact figures. Our distinguished ambassador made it clear yesterday as well, and the Turkish President Erdogan also announced, declared it and said, repeated several times. The current situation in Turkey, and Turkey is neither willing nor will not able to accommodate any more refugees from anywhere. It's clear. So at the beginning of my remarks, I should put it forward clearly once again. That's because, as I have just described, for the last decade, we have been hosting almost around currently above 4 million, but generally on average around 4 million refugees. And it's not just number. As again, I refer one more time to my ambassador. Yesterday he said it. More than 700,000 Syrian babies were born in Turkish hospitals. Last month, after a long break, Turkish schools are opened again. And roughly, approximately 800 Syrian children started to schools alongside their Turkish peers. And they are all educated in Turkish public schools free of charge alongside the Turkish kids. So these are not just numbers. These are not easy jobs. These are difficult jobs. And we know over the recent 2 years, we have been living a situation of pandemic. And we have witnessed a harsh competition among countries in order to reach the vaccination. And I'm sharing with you with pride that Turkey, alongside its own nationals, Turkey is applying vaccination to Syrians and to all other refugees and all other foreigners in Turkey, totally based on the same criteria with its own nations. So all these are not easy jobs. Therefore, our capacity, we have overused our capacity. And for Turkey, it's not possible to welcome any more refugees from any other country, from any country. Vis-a-vis your second part of your question, first of all, let me say that it seems to me that your question implies an underlying perception that a new wave of migration from Afghanistan is inevitable. And I know yesterday some speakers also mentioned about the regular flow of Afghans to neighboring Iran and Pakistan. And we are aware of the fact that the current scenario, current picture is not bright, and that does not let us be optimistic for the future. Yet, we also all know that a good migration management should start at the source, at the country of origin, at the source. So therefore, before trying to understand which country can host these newcomers, we should concentrate our efforts on the source country, on the country of origin. So what can be done inside Afghanistan in order to prevent a new influx of migrants? So in this regard, if you want to learn what kind of role Turkey can play, and whether how can involve in aid campaigns in Afghanistan. I mean, first of all, I would like to share with you that Turkey is already operating in Afghanistan. We have never closed our embassy in Kabul. our ambassador in Kabul has never left Afghanistan and is still there and still coordinating our diplomatic efforts or fulfilling its mission. And some Turkish governmental institutions in the field, such as TİKA. Turkish Red Crescent is operating in Afghanistan, currently operating in Afghanistan. And alongside these rather formal institutions, many Turkish NGOs are in Afghanistan and currently continuing to conduct their operations. So in this regard, what I can tell you is that Turkey is active in Afghanistan in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of humanitarian aids, and will continue to do so. However, Turkey is, again, I will go back to the issue of Syrians inside Turkey. But Turkey's problem, the current burden Turkey is undertaken is really huge. And our ambassador described it yesterday as we have exhausted our energy and capacity. So it's not an easy job. There is another point I would like to clarify and share with you is, I said that, I mentioned about 3.7 million Syrians inside Turkey. However, alongside the Turkish-Syrian borders, there are 6 million Syrians inside Syria. And this population relies largely on Turkey as well. 3.8 million people live in Idlib region, in Idlib. We know Idlib, all of us. And the only route to deliver humanitarian assistance to that region is via Turkey, as we know. And Turkish NGOs are operative in the region as well. And so far we have constructed more than 50,000 briquette houses in the region, in Idlib, just in Idlib. And almost 40,000 of those 50,000 have begun to be occupied by people. I mean, when I say occupied, they are in use. For example, many other services in this region are being provided by Turkey. Idlib, there is a Security Council resolution for Idlib. However, with regards to other regions inside Turkey, inside Syria, I mean, these are Afrin, Jarablus, Tel Abyad, and 2 million Syrians live in this region, in that part of Syria. And unfortunately, there isn't any Security Council resolutions for this region, and UN agencies are not operating in those parts of Syria. And international NGOs do not help to the people in this region. Even, for example, let me share something with you. Vaccination, I'm not talking about COVID vaccination, I'm talking about routinized child vaccination. World Health Organization do not provide childhood vaccination for that part of Syria, based on the excuse that there is no Security Council resolution. All of these goods are provided to that people by Turkey. Therefore, I mean, I understand people taking into account Turkey's hospitality vis-à-vis Syrians. People are expecting and hoping that Turkey can do something, but I'm afraid the situation is not like that. And moreover, once again, I will refer to my ambassador. Yesterday, he put it forward as well. We are also trying to understand the possibilities for voluntary and dignified return, because we heavily invested for the public infrastructure in that part of Syria, in those parts of Syria. For us, we constructed hospitals, we constructed schools, we constructed playgrounds for children. Of course, we won't force anyone. We won't even encourage Syrians, but we are trying to create suitable atmosphere where people will be willing to return, totally based on their free will, based on their own decision. Just if you let me check if there is anything missing point, if I have time, of course.
Very little, yes.
Okay. I think that's fair enough now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General. I think your point is very well noted and very clear. That message, we heard that yesterday too, but it also shows, of course, the Syrian conflict and the Syrian refugee issue is also not resolved, and we're just moving from one crisis to the other, but should not also be forgetting, of course, all the efforts that are underway to address still another ongoing crisis and issue in the region. But you've mentioned the need to do something in Afghanistan, that we should, of course, focus our efforts, first of all, on Afghanistan. So I'd like to ask to you, Joost, as the Netherlands, you've been also an important partner in Afghanistan. You have been present in NATO coalition, in ISAF forces, but you were also contributing through aid to, of course, providing civilian aid for capacity building and for migration governance in the Netherlands. So what is the Dutch stance right now? What kind of efforts would your government be likely to make towards reconstruction of Afghanistan, especially when it comes to, of course, stemming further displacement, possible further displacement and irregular migration, but also maybe development and other issues?
Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, also given this, well, shared history of the last 2 decades, I mean, we are among the nations who feel that there is moral obligation to assist the Afghan people and preserve what's left of their human rights. But it's more than a moral obligation, there's also just a very straightforward strategic interest here. And a strategic interest that we share with Turkey, with countries in the region and with others to avoid instability from spreading into the region and beyond. So it's the two. And I think there's 4 tracks that we try to pursue here. The first and most immediate one is evacuation and safe passage for those Afghans directly at risk under the new regime. Think about those who assisted us in our missions or in our development projects, who stood up for human rights or for the rule of law. That's one, that's an immediate concern. Second, as Mr. Unlu said, the huge interest of stopping a total humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan itself. Humanitarian aid is direly needed. We very much hope the Taliban is willing to respect humanitarian principles, so let us do it. But in all fairness, we have to move beyond humanitarian aid alone. It will not be enough. So we may have to provide also basic needs and livelihoods. But that's where it gets complicated. Because yes, we are very eager to help the Afghan people. At the same time, we do not want to legitimize the Taliban any further than necessary. So it's a delicate balance here. And if you move from humanitarian aid into development, there's a delicate balance to strike. And the way we see it right now is that the things that you ask kindly in case of humanitarian assistance really become conditions when you're looking at development aid. So crucially, we believe that now we can only help to provide basic needs on a temporary basis in those areas of Afghanistan where our conditions can be met. And the main conditions are pretty straightforward. You know, access for all, including women, girls, ethnic minorities, and no interference from the Taliban financially or otherwise. It's a delicate balance, but we have to find it in order to help the Afghan people while not legitimizing the Taliban more than necessary. The third track is investing in the countries in the region, who already have been bearing quite a burden and may be facing more if instability spreads. So that means reaching out, more political dialogue, where possible, capacity building, operational cooperation, and indeed support for the offering of protection of refugees in the region, as we've done for a while, but which maybe have to be intensified. And then the fourth and last track is international burden sharing. So then you look at resettlement and all the legal pathways. I mean, within the European Union, we're really working, trying to coordinate among ourselves with other countries, with Canada, US, UK, others, in how to coordinate this and how to support that both financially and operationally. And just purely speaking for the Netherlands, I mean, in the coming period, we will absolutely be flexible when it comes to urgent requests from the region for Afghans at risk when it comes to resettlement. So these 4 tracks in parallel, together with the countries in the region and on the potential migration routes, because of its moral obligation, but it's also very much a strategic interest that we all share.
Thank you, Joost. Maybe we can come back to that as well, because I know that there is already concern that it's just taking too long and that the focus of the international community may already be moving somewhere else when it comes to, of course, these evacuation, legal pathways, resettlement. I know that the EU is undertaking efforts right now in this respect, and hope that these efforts will put the focus once again on these dire needs. So I'd like to ask you, Kevin, as a representative of UNHCR. Of course, UNHCR is one of the most consequential agencies of the UN working in the region. Indeed, the aid and humanitarian relief through the UNHCR has tremendously helped to curtail the human suffering in the region in the past, and is also doing so. You are still in the country. So despite the change in the authorities in Afghanistan and the instability on the ground, you are there, you're continuing to operate, and which is commendable. Given the special position that the agency finds itself right now in, how do you see the situation evolving? We heard about the humanitarian crisis, but also what are the acute needs of the displaced right now and other vulnerable groups in Afghanistan. But I would also like to hear from you in relation to that. We've heard about the engagement with Taliban. So how does that work right now on the ground? How does it look practically? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to center my remarks on people who've been forced to flee, whether they're forced to flee from their homes internally within Afghanistan or across borders to Pakistan, to Iran, to neighboring states, and further afield. And in addition to looking at the situation, I want to suggest a few concrete areas where we are responding and where we can respond together to a very, very complex situation with no easy answers. If you pull back and look at the big picture, there are currently 3.5 million people who are internally displaced because of conflict, because of fighting or human rights violations within Afghanistan. That's out of 38 million people. You have almost 10% of the population who's been forced out of their homes. You've seen the images on BBC and Al Jazeera of the precarious situation in which some of those most recently displaced find themselves. This year alone, about 660,000 people have been forcibly displaced. So that's one part of the equation, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But on the other side of the equation are the neighboring countries. Pakistan, that has 1.4 million registered Afghan refugees, plus several million undocumented workers who have over the years gone back and forth for family reasons, for employment reasons. And I won't speak in great detail about that population, but I acknowledge my friends from the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, who are here. And of course, there are a lot of synergies and things that have to be unpacked in that context as well, because it's a complex composition, the population. On the other side of the border, on the Iranian side of the border, we see about 780,000 registered Afghan refugees. And then again, anywhere from 1 to 2 million undocumented Afghans. And a lot of back and forth, a lot of cross-border movement. If we look to Central Asia, we see much smaller numbers. The total number in the 5 Central Asian states of Afghans is around 15,000. And the bulk of those are in Tajikistan. We heard from our colleague yesterday about this 1,400-kilometer border with Tajikistan, which is quite porous. We think if you look at the Central Asian states, that's probably where the highest risk of cross-border movement would occur. But clearly the greatest risk is into Pakistan and into Iran. And as our colleagues have mentioned in the notion of international burden sharing, the Islamic republics of Iran and Pakistan have generously hosted these refugees for over 40 years. So I'll get to that aspect of the equation, but first turning internally in engagement with the Taliban. Unlike member states as a UN humanitarian agency, I might say we don't have the luxury to assess whether we engage or not. It's a humanitarian imperative. We've had no choice but to engage. In the aftermath of 15 August, we had a slight reduction in our international footprint in the country, which quickly was corrected. People went back into the country. Our High Commissioner was one of the first senior UN officials to meet with the Taliban. In those discussions, we were very frank, very clear in what our requirements are to operate. First and foremost, security, not an easy ask. They have made commitments to us that they will try to provide that security, but of course we've seen IS Khorasan and other extremist groups operating in the country, which pose a risk that we have to manage. But nonetheless, this is something that we've discussed very frankly with the Taliban. We've also discussed the issue of having our female staff members able to work in the field, because ultimately we're helping not just men, but also women and girls. We've also had discussions about access, humanitarian access within the country. I think it's fair to say that we've had a productive, frank discussion with the current ad interim government, the acting officials, but a number of challenges remain. That said, we have at the same time scaled up our response. We have historically had a very wide presence throughout the entire country, but we just issued a fast-track compendium to advertise additional international posts. We are upscaling in a fairly substantial way. We're also upscaling in terms of our supply pipelines and ability to deliver. We just opened up a logistics hub in Termez, Uzbekistan. We have an existing pipeline coming through Karachi in Pakistan. And this is not just UNHCR. This is part of the UN family, NGOs, working together to try to dramatically scale up this response. Now, on this note, I just want to emphasize something that all of you have seen in the news and it's in your minds, and that's when we talk about stability and the potential for outflows of people, there are at least two facets of that. On the one hand, we have the humanitarian response. We need to make sure that people have food. We need to make sure they have access to medical care, that they have the basic humanitarian needs met. And that's our job as UNHCR. But equally critical from our vantage point in terms of drivers of potential cross-border movements or internal displacement is the other side of the coin, which relates to government services, to the economy, to ensuring there's a basic liquidity in cash within the market. And these are issues that are much more complex, and where member states, where the IMF, the World Bank, other financial institutions are going to have to make certain pragmatic decisions, in our view, to ensure that at a minimum we have basic liquidity in the economy, that people have the ability to work, to put food on the table, that there are still government services, that people can go to see a doctor, that there is education, the basic services that people need. This is not our remit as UNHCR, as the UN Refugee Agency, or as the UN indeed, but this is something that member states are grappling with. And how does that look? Is it humanitarian plus? Is it veering towards development? This will also fall within the ambit of financial instruments and financial institutions. So both of those ambits, both of those spheres need to be addressed urgently. And I can tell you very clearly that in our estimation, if they are not addressed with a sense of urgency, particularly as the winter months approach in Afghanistan, we face a very real risk of substantial cross-border movements into Pakistan, into Iran, and I don't have to tell the group sitting here today that could potentially result in flows to Europe as well. So we think that both ambits are critical and must be addressed immediately. I'll just briefly say that we think it's equally important to support and stand with our friends from Pakistan and Iran, who have generously hosted all of these refugees and a number of undocumented individuals for so many years. If we don't do that, there won't be the protection space there for the existing refugees, but if there is a movement of additional refugees, they won't be able to absorb them. At the same time, I think it's important to make clear at this point in time, UNHCR's position is that it is not the time for returning Afghans to Afghanistan. The situation is very kinetic, it's very volatile, it's evolving. We don't know for sure how it's going to play out. But at this time, we have a very clear advisory on non-returns for the moment. Of course, our hope is that as things evolve, people can eventually go home. That's what everybody would wish for any refugee, and refugees themselves generally want to go home. But the conditions have to be right, it has to be safe, it has to be voluntary, in conditions of dignity. So a lot of things to grapple with on the cross-border side and also internally within the country. I'll probably leave it at that, but I can expand as the panel evolves and we continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think I'd like to come back to the issue of Iran and Pakistan at a later stage. You've mentioned the cooperation, what needs to be done with those countries in the region. But I want to ask you, Khyber, now. You are outside of Afghanistan. You are part of the Afghan diaspora and one of the brilliant minds that has left the country. So what can be done by the international community, or what are the expectations right now of the Afghan diaspora to aid in the ongoing situation in Afghanistan? You've touched upon that, but of course, but I would like to ask you to elaborate a little more on that. So what is, there is a lot of Afghan diaspora in Europe, there's a lot in Turkey, but also in the US, Canada, and in a few other countries as well. So what are those expectations and how can that aid be, how can Afghanistan be aided?
Sure, thank you. So I think there is a lot of internal thinking with some of the activists who left, trying to think how can they still politically engage, making sure that there's a voice for both the Afghans who have left the country and who are in Afghanistan. But I think as they're settling in there, the first thing I would say is expedite the regular migration. I think most of the Afghans who left in the evacuations, except for a few countries, a lot are still sort of in the air. Those that were evacuated, for example, by the US. And this is more a common problem, so I'd focus on that. And the other, which is a problem Afghan refugees have been facing in a lot of countries, there are specific barriers that need to be addressed. They can't open bank accounts until they've had some documentation, depending on which countries we're talking about. I think a lot of them would be, for example, thinking about setting up businesses. So there's help that can be provided in that area in terms of providing an enabling environment for them to set up businesses. There was, I think, a brilliant group also in Kabul who were doing these investments who have now left. And then obviously there are a lot other who I think could benefit from the opportunity of access to sort of higher education. I think, for postgraduate, undergraduate or postgraduate that perhaps could be provided. So I think these are a few specific areas where I would say the countries, the host countries, international community as a whole can assist.
Thank you very much. We have roughly about half an hour, so I'll be asking further questions, and then I already see there are questions from the online audience and probably also in the room. But Mr. Ünlü, can Turkey use its influence to improve compliance of good, humane and rights-based governance in Afghanistan? Will you be putting efforts in that direction?
I mean, Turkey has been and is an active player in international fora, in regional and international issues. And in all its activities, Turkey always works for the benefit of people in those countries and in the regions. And the current situation in Afghanistan is not an exception of this general principle either. However, I believe no one has to contemplate a role for Turkey. I mean, everyone, all countries should develop their own strategies, their own plan. Of course, the joint plans, joint initiatives may play a key role in alleviating the situation in Afghanistan. And in such a situation, Turkey also will consider its own what kind of contribution it may put forward. Or, however, I believe, I mean, as I have just described it in the first session, Turkey is enough problem in itself with the Syrian issue and with the other issues. Therefore, apart from this general approach, I believe no one should rely on Turkey in this account. But as I said, Turkey is trying to share its knowledge, its experience with everyone, with all the relevant parties. It's not a formal information. It's not a formal information sharing, but a delegation from the current administration in Afghanistan was in Turkey, in Ankara last week. But I don't have any information about the details, but I'm sure we share our general principles with them as well. But we should find practical solutions, develop practical solutions to deliver these humanitarian aids, development aids to Afghanistan. I'm aware of the fact that there are some hesitancy to develop relations with the current administration in Afghanistan, but we should find a practical way. And these pragmatic relations may facilitate the political dialogue in the future. We don't know. We can't say for sure at this stage. But, you know, in international relations, it's always a possibility. So I think, I mean, therefore, this is my position. This is our position.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's also, once again, very clear. So, working in Afghanistan, Jos, you've also mentioned that, and that there should be, of course, certain conditions met to be able to engage in Afghanistan with the new regime, both for delivery of humanitarian aid as well as, of course, more development support. So, how do you think could the Netherlands or Europe help to ensure that human rights of Afghans, both in the country but also on the move, are upheld, and that adequate protection is made available to those seeking refuge? Is the Netherlands doing anything at the EU level in this regard?
Well, we're definitely trying. No, I think it is very much the four tracks as I described them earlier. There's the evacuation bit. There's the assistance in Afghanistan, there's the outreach and cooperation with countries in the region and on the potential migration route, and there's the burden sharing. And on all of them, you know, we definitely can't do it alone, and we have to do it with, well, first of all, with the countries in the region and the big players around it, like Turkey. And indeed, you cannot just work on one track. You have to work on all four combined. And you need to coordinate and cooperate on a very intense level. And I'm sure there will be, you know, political issues to be navigated every now and then. But there is this huge joint strategic interest. And, you know, specifically on Turkey, I mean, it was discussed twice yesterday. You know, Turkey has been generously hosting a huge number of refugees in the past years, and we are very well aware of that and very grateful for that. So, given that existing burden and given their geographical position, I mean, I fully understand what Mr. Undu is saying. But I believe that we do have, with other countries, this huge strategic interest in making sure that we keep the situation as stable as possible, prevent a humanitarian disaster from happening, and then make sure that whenever instability starts spreading, that we work together to contain it. And that's a joint strategic interest. It was said, you know, Turkey is a NATO member, is an EU candidate member state. We have shown the world before with the EU-Turkey statement what we can do if we really have a strategic interest together. So also there, I believe that we have to work together to adopt the changing circumstances and offer sustainable solutions for refugees, no matter what their nationality is.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, you've talked about, of course, burden sharing as well, and also the need to work with with the governments in the region. So, Kevin, I want to ask you, as UNHCR has been working extensively, of course, not only with the Afghan government, but also with the countries in the region. For example, the Quadrilateral Coordination Group on Afghanistan. What do you think is the way out of the current impasse in terms of restrictions placed on movement of persons in need of humanitarian assistance and other vulnerable groups? And what kind of solutions can be devised within and outside of Afghanistan to aid this displaced? What will happen with the solution strategy?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I mean, so maybe for the larger context for the audience, I'll talk about kind of two different things. One is a political mechanism whereby we have historically engaged with the governments of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, the quadripartite group. But then the second thing, which maybe in some ways is more interesting for this group in terms of solutions, is something called the Solution Strategy for Afghan Refugees. And there is a support platform for that that is chaired by the European Union. This was launched as part of the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Refugee Forum. And a number of the member states in this room are actually part of that group. So I'll talk about both. But maybe on the first side, which is maybe more of the political side in the sub-region, we had actually planned to have our annual quadripartite meeting in Brussels about a month ago. Unfortunately, because of the events in August and the change in the government, it wasn't practical for us to do that because one of the partners at the table, it wasn't entirely clear who would be coming to that meeting and if we were to have it. That said, we very much plan to continue with the quadripartite process. And this gives us an opportunity to discuss the situation of Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Iran. Eventually, we hope it will give us the opportunity to talk about conditions for return and the projects that we're doing in that regard. In terms of your more maybe immediate question on the borders and border management, this has not necessarily been something that has been raised in that particular forum in the past, but it's something that we have bilaterally discussed with the governments that are contiguous to Afghanistan, where, as many of you will have seen in media reporting, the borders have been quite closed, quite restricted in terms of movement. Our position as UNHCR, and this would be the same position that we would share with EU member states or with other European colleagues and friends, is that robust border management is critical. It's important, it's imperative, it's a sovereign right of any state, but there need to be safeguards for people who are legitimately fleeing persecution, for someone who fears for their life, who needs to get international protection to cross an international border. So as we would do with member states in this room, we do the same with our friends from Iran, from Tajikistan, from Pakistan, and try to offer that support, whether it be with screening mechanisms or ways to process cases in the asylum context. So on the other side, we have kind of looking forward, looking ahead to solutions. Now, the solution strategy for Afghan refugees and the core group that supports it has historically looked at essentially two things. On the one hand, we've looked to support the governments of Iran and Pakistan who are hosting together well over 2 million refugees, registered refugees. But on the other hand, we've tried to do area-based programming within Afghanistan to try to create the conditions for return so that people can go back home in a way that is sustainable. Now, currently, that unfortunately is not going to be possible in the immediate term. We think now is not the time for returns. However, the same mechanisms that we've used within Afghanistan, area-based, community-based programming, education, health, livelihoods projects, are yielding dividends in the context of IDPs, so internally displaced people. There aren't a lot of happy stories at the moment, but we have seen some positive indications since 15 August with comparatively more peaceful conditions. Of the 660,000 conflict IDPs this year, we have seen over 100,000 return this year. So that's significant. not to overstate that, there's still many challenges and many hurdles and obstacles that will have to be addressed and overcome. But there are some people who are going home, IDPs, conflict internally displaced IDPs. And the solution strategy for Afghan refugees in these priority areas of return and reintegration that we have worked on, there are 40 of them in the country, have been receiving IDPs. So we hope eventually we'll be able to continue with the return of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, Iran, and further afield even. But for the moment, that seems difficult. And I mean, I would just say, and if I may, I'm seeing one of the questions here on the screen, and I'll tell you what it says. Someone's saying, well, hey, you know, this sounds like this could be an interesting opportunity to do what the Global Refugee Compact talks about, when you talk about the humanitarian development peace nexus, and that's exactly right. And that's what these priority areas of return and integration are about. They're community-based, area-based programming in education, health, livelihoods. It's not just about helping the refugees who've returned or the IDPs who may be coming back, but also the community who's there. So that has a stabilizing effect, not to overstate how much we can do as UNHCR in the peace context, but it has some type of stabilizing effect, at least locally in a province and a community. And then by bringing in development actors like our friends from UNDP or ADB or the World Bank or others, we're able to implement programs in education, health, livelihoods that are a benefit to everybody in the community. So these are the types of maybe small wins that we see, even in the midst of what can appear to be a rather chaotic and unpredictable situation. But we find as UNHCR that when we ground ourselves in the communities and in real projects that help real people, we can still advance, even amidst complexity.
Thank you very much also for answering that question on screen. Just a very short question, very short reply. Are you working with the community development councils that Khyber has mentioned at village level?
Yes, and I have to be honest, I don't know exactly the state of play. I mean, in the current situation post-August 15th, but these priority areas of return and reintegration are part of DIRIC, the Afghanistan development program and the strategic framework that has been existing, the community development organizations locally, but also local ministries like the ministries of rural development, which have very interesting projects that we coordinate with. So that is part of it. I don't know the current state of play of that because things I think are in motion and evolving, but the answer in short is yes. And we want to do that and continue doing that.
Yes, I think it's important to make use of those previous investments and those structures that were put in place. Thank you very much. I would now like to move actually to the questions session from the audience. We do have about 10 minutes, so I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, there are several, so please, let's start with you, Henrik.
Yes, hello, good morning everybody. It's Henrik Angerstjerne from the Danish Migration Ministry. I have a question, I think mostly to UNHCR. Out of the registered refugees in Pakistan and Iran, could you give us an impression as to for how long have these refugees stayed? Are there those who have arrived recently? Are there those who are absorbed, you can say, and just live normal lives as part of the normal Pakistani life? Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe let's get your question as well.
Excuse me, Vit Novotny. I just want to ask about the role of resettlement as the panel sees it. Is there a space in your view to resettle people from Afghanistan if there is a need, and if there is willingness, of course, to resettle them elsewhere? And what would be the mechanics? Where would they be resettled from? Thank you.
Thank you. I see no further questions, so let's start with those. Kevin, please.
Sure. So definitely is one.
Oh, sorry, there is one more.
Hi, thank you to all the speakers. My name is Milica Petrovic. I'm the director of the European Programme for Integration and Migration. We're the largest philanthropic collaborative working on migration issues in Europe. So I have a question to all four of the speakers. You spoke a lot on the state actors and international organizations. I'd be really keen to see where you think that civil society organizations can play a role, and for private investors supporting civil society organizations both in Europe but also in the region. whether it's on family reunification, complementary pathways, inclusion in Europe, but of course also the needs in the region. So basically the non-state actors, where do you see their role? Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin, please.
Yeah, no, thanks, Heinrich, for the question on breaking down kind of the populations of registered refugees in Iran and Pakistan. Again, just to pull back, you've got 780,000 who are registered in Iran. Then you've got anywhere from 1 to 2 million who aren't registered, but maybe now have international protection needs. And then you've got 1.4 million in Pakistan, and again, another 1 to 2 million. So of those populations that are registered, the majority of them have been in Pakistan for quite some time. And some have been there for generations, as long as now 42 years. But I think perhaps what your question is leading me to is, have we seen people crossing the borders seeking international protection? The answer is yes, but in relatively small numbers. We've seen some movements into Tajikistan, but we're talking in the low thousands. In Iran, we've seen around 20,000 who have approached us, indicating that they are seeking international protection, and in Pakistan, around 10,000. Now, these numbers aren't small, but relative to those populations, it's relatively small. And if you compare that to the 3.5 million IDPs, it's relatively small. Now, the caveat here, and this is an important caveat, is we don't have access or the ability to opine with great authority on what's happening in certain parts of the Iranian border or the Pakistani border. So we receive reports, and you see some of these reports also in the media, about larger numbers crossing into Iran and into Pakistan. And indeed, our distinguished colleague from the Islamic Republic of Iran yesterday, the ambassador here, mentioned his observations from the Iranian perspective of higher numbers. We have seen a slight spike in movement into Iran. We have seen some upticks, but I would very much defer to our colleague from Turkey to speak about Turkey in terms of movements into Europe. But the bottom line is we haven't seen a massive outflow, which some of us feared could happen. That said, our position remains that if we don't address these two ambits, humanitarian plus the more development, financial, liquidity, economic aspects, quite quickly, there is a real prospect for major outflows. And not to overstate things, but our own High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, I think has described it as potentially catastrophic. If we really don't address those issues inside Afghanistan, but also provide the support that's required in Pakistan and Iran. So that would be my response to that. I can speak briefly to the resettlement question as well. This is a good question, and those of you who are from EU member states may be aware of this recent meeting, which included UNHCR, and our High Commissioner had suggested that in the next 5 years, we estimate, and this is just an estimate, that we may need 85,000 resettlement slots for the Afghan people, for Afghan refugees. And he asked if Europe could meet half of that. And there was a commitment in principle, I understand, from Brussels, although I very much defer to colleagues here in the room who may wish to opine or clarify on that the EU could in principle take 42,500 of those slots over 5 years. Now, of course, these are just projections and estimations, and depending on how things evolve, we may need more slots. We may, may face a situation where we need to resettle more people. The thing that I would say about the resettlement side, a couple things. One is it's different than evacuations. So the in-country evacuations that we've seen, for example, in very large numbers from the US, where you had 122,000 people evacuated in short order, is different than resettlement. And the difference is administrative and bureaucratic, but it's also in terms of what that tool means. And when we talk about resettlement, we're talking about refugees in a country of asylum who have protection needs in that country of asylum. In other words, they may not feel safe there, or they may be particularly vulnerable and need to be therefore moved to another country. It can also be used as a tool more strategically to share the burden or the responsibility of hosting those refugees. But we should also be very frank that when we're talking about, say 85,000 refugees over 5 years, that's not really going to make a dent in the larger challenge, because you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of people. But strategically, it's an important tool. And from our vantage point, I think it's a tool, and I think this was discussed in one of the panels yesterday, where Europe, for example, can say we're part of the game. We are engaged in resettlement, and we're sharing some of the responsibility by doing that. The last thing I'll say, and this is maybe a little bit unrelated, but I think it's an important point to make. In our discussions with Pakistan and Iran about access to asylum, one of the things that we've also heard behind closed doors is it's also important that that same message of access to asylum is shared with our friends in other countries, including European states. In other words, they're watching to see how Europe addresses the issue. And if I may very humbly make the suggestion to a group of esteemed colleagues here from Europe, I think by doing the right thing when it comes to having a robust migration management system, but with safeguards, by doing the right thing in that context and providing access to asylum to those who may make it to your borders, that sends the right message to the Iranians and Pakistanis. Because if you tell those governments, you should be doing this, but we're not going to do it, they may say, well, maybe we're not going to do it either. And then we could find ourselves in a much more complicated situation. Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out. I had that feeling also yesterday in yesterday's panel discussion that this was a kind of expectation and everybody is looking at one another in this respect. But you also, what is your take on that, on resettlement and on, and also if you want to answer to the other question on the role of state actors and non-state actors.
Okay, well, first of all, on your last point, yes, this is true. As I tried to make in the point I tried to make in my earlier contribution, these tracks have to go together, and there has got to be international burden sharing. We all have, again, a big interest. We see potential instability coming our way in all kinds of forms, not just irregular migration, but we're also looking at terrorism, drugs trafficking, etc., in the region and beyond. So there's this huge interest. At the same time, we all have our populations to convince, and that's true everywhere. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we have to do it together, and it has to work both ways. On NGOs, I think I didn't mention them, but yes, of course. I mean, first of all, NGOs have been on the ground for decades, and with UNHCR, IOM are still on the ground in many cases. So there's an enormous amount of boots on the ground and knowledge there. And for instance, in the evacuation process and what follows from that, we worked very closely with our NGO community, providing names, getting, well, practical support, etc. So that is something that has to continue. And of course, also in the whole process of providing humanitarian assistance and anything that grows from that, we will need the NGOs desperately. And I think the key work now is, well, the delicate balance I spoke about earlier, that we as governments have to sort of help create a situation, an environment in which the NGOs can do their work. This is roughly how I see it.
Thank you, Joost. Director General Ünlü, I'd like to also ask you to respond to this question. We are really now, well, roughly 2 minutes to finish, but there's also a question from the online audience on learning from the Syrian refugee crisis. How differently should the currently unfolding situation be managed? Perhaps you may want to also respond to that.
Try to be as concise as possible, and I would like to finish with a few words about the resettlement processes. First of all, the solution lies inside Afghanistan, and we should increase our efforts to prevent the new influx of migrants from Afghanistan, and that's an urgent issue. And for those who in any way will leave Afghanistan, international communities, Western world should way of communication with Iran, and these communication channels should be open. And the same goes for Pakistan as well. And also, to say a few things about resettlements and burden sharing. Burden sharing is not just about providing financial support. Unfortunately, some circles in Western world consider burden sharing as providing financial support. And there is a mindset that, okay, we will provide money and these people will stay there forever. I'm afraid that's not a fair understanding. Therefore, the burden sharing also should include a smoothly working resettlement system. Unfortunately, the current resettlement system have some deficiencies. Let me explain very briefly. For example, every year, only 10% of those who I receive international applications, protection application, only 10% of those people can be resettled to third countries. And the process is quite long, and health check, security checks, and many other checks. They look at the ages, the education level, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, what I wonder is whether those countries are really trying to share the burden with neighboring countries of conflicts, or trying to find suitable people who can contribute to their own system. And that's I know that question may trigger a new debate, and we don't have time for it, but we should bear in mind this kind of provocative questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Khyber, I'd also like to maybe also ask you for your final words, but there is another interesting question from the online audience, which we will not be able to go into, but I think it's still worth to mention that are there any current negotiations planned between the EU and the USA regarding an appropriate response to the consequence of the withdrawal of the Western forces in Afghanistan, or is this now mainly a debate among EU and Asian countries in closer geographic position? I think that's also a good question, but we won't be able to go into that. But I'd like to also ask you, Khyber, maybe if you want to respond to resettlement issues and role of other actors.
Yeah, sure. So I think the role of non-state actors, particularly civil society, can be at least across three areas that come to my mind right now. So one is all the priorities I talked about in Afghanistan, the work they can do to, it can be technical assistance, it can be fundraising, whatever, or around advocacy issues that will be focused on Afghanistan. But I think they can work closely with the diaspora around, some of them I know have already actively contributed to the evacuation, raising funds. Not all countries are generous or have the resources to provide the new and old diaspora with a lot of much needed assistance. So I think that's one immediate area where I think a lot of these non-state actors can play a role in sort of local fundraising. The second important area is around, I think, integration. These new groups, they go to places where there are quite mixed feelings about them. Obviously, I think with the new diaspora, at least I could, in most countries, I could sense a lot of empathy for Afghans. But I think there's need for engaging with those host communities, making sure that there is that sort of social cohesion, that the diaspora continued to be sort of welcomed and accepted. And then there's a lot of important work the civil society or these non-state actors can do with the governments, with the host governments, in terms of a lot of the various barriers that I talked about that the refugees are facing in terms of trying to address those barriers. So,
thank you very much. I think what we can conclude is that Afghanistan is at a crossroads, and its future remains still very uncertain, and peace remains also elusive even after the Taliban takeover. So after all, the Taliban, the new regime, will face similar challenges, actually even more acute challenges as the former government, whether it will remain as a Taliban government or a perhaps a more all-inclusive government we will see in the next days. But I think it's important that we have discussed today to shed a little bit of light on the salient issues surrounding post-conflict recovery, stabilization, and the critical steps that need to be taken right now. I would like to thank all of my panelists and hope to engage in further discussions in the future. And I'd like to invite everyone to a coffee break right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.